Why did homelessness get worse in Seattle between 2021 and 2024, despite getting the single largest one-time drop of aid from Congress in its history, worth roughly $25 million a year? This video is going to answer that question from the perspective of a person who was there and who had a role in administering a slice of that money. And that answer is not fraud, waste, or abuse. It's not incompetence or mismanagement. And it isn't even one set of politics over another. Any of those things would be so much easier. Because the answer is actually found in the design of our government itself, who holds the purse strings and the power for making certain kinds of very important decisions. This is the part 3 video in the 3-part series for American civic builders. And that's you if you're genuinely curious about how we make a better America. And you're either working at changing things or you're figuring out how you can, especially in your local community. And this video is the one where we talk about what not to do when you want to go about changing something. If you've gotten this far in the series, thank you for sticking with it, because you might find that this is the one you most need to understand. Because the situation in Seattle is emblematic of what's happening in a lot of places, where we spend a lot of money and we don't change anything at all. Preventing situations like this and designing the future we want is going to take more people understanding why things like this can happen. And I'd argue it's also key to healing some of our political divisions and preserving the ideals embedded in the Constitution itself. And it's not like change isn't possible. In part 2, we saw exactly the strategies employed by Milwaukee to effectively execute housing first and achieve an extraordinary 92% reduction in chronic homelessness. And I also gave you a framework you can apply to any civic issue to help you develop the right strategy to effectuate change. And you do need a strategy, because at this late stage in American history, we've evolved so many layers in our civic ecosystem and so many streams of funding, actors, public, private, regulations at every level, a condition I call civic sprawl, that if you can't get them to align and operate coherently, you're just not getting anywhere at all. In this video, we're also going to see how you can use that framework as a diagnostic tool to help you think through exactly why something in the public sphere isn't working as intended, in a rational, structured way that helps you get to the bottom of it for real. But before we get into it, I need to be clear about something. This story is deeply personal. I had a role in this as an executive at a housing authority in the Seattle Metro, and I debated whether I should share this story at all. Of course, the views I'm sharing here are entirely my own. They don't reflect the positions of any organization I mention or work for, but that's not the reason I debated whether or not I should share it. It's because there's a ton of nuance that risks getting lost, especially if you don't make it through to the end. Individual elements of this story, taken in isolation, could lead to very wrong conclusions. Fraud, waste, and abuse in federal spending is all over the news right now, and some people think that's just all there is to it. This story could lead people to the erroneous conclusion that all government spending is bad, inefficient, and ineffective. But that's just not the case. And yet others think you shouldn't question government spending at all, because when you do, it's easy for the other side to just weaponize that story. But we should question government spending and learn how to talk to each other about it. The entire reason I left my cushy job in private philanthropy to go work for government is because I saw people finding a better way at a large scale, and I wanted to join them. And questioning how we spend, applying intellectual rigor, and just being curious instead of concluded is the only way we'll ever be able to spend public money more effectively. And this is one curious story. Because the Seattle region had everything going for it. Millions of dollars in emergency funding. Some of the brightest minds in the sector working on this issue. McKinsey's global management consultants. Genuine political will to solve the problem. A solid, evidence-based model, housing first. Plus, you had some of the world's largest and most successful companies in the world and a booming local economy. And yet, this injection of funds still didn't work. Homelessness got worse. Why? Well, the answer is found only by looking at how America is designed and how it's working now, especially at the local level. It's found by taking a very close look at how we organize power and our resources. And it's about what happens when even smart, well-funded, well-intentioned efforts run into a government structure that isn't capable of delivering results, no matter how much money you throw at it. Stick with me to the end and you'll see exactly what I mean. So let's jump in. The year is 2021. Congress has just passed the American Rescue Plan Act, otherwise known as ARPA, in the spring. This was the last of the major pandemic stimulus bills, the ones that resulted in those checks going out to most Americans. Well, one of the things in that bill was something called the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, and it was designed to provide emergency housing directly to homeless people to get them off the street. These vouchers would flow through HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program, aka Section 8, the nation's largest housing subsidy program, which I explained more deeply in Part 2. And what was I doing? Well, I was driving across the country, about to start a new job running the federally funded housing programs at the King County Housing Authority in the Seattle area, which includes this very program. Now, as an aside, a few years prior, I had left a pretty cool job as a philanthropic grant maker to join this field of housing. And when I did that, I asked the question, what's the best housing authority in the country? Who is doing the most innovative, groundbreaking, evidence-based work? And the answer was always King County Housing Authority. And I can talk more about those innovations some other time, like the Creating Moves to Opportunity project, or how they were the first housing authority in the nation to use bond financing to create a separate housing portfolio of 9,000 affordable housing units. So I was really pumped I had gotten this job, and I would be in an environment of people pushing the edge on what government can accomplish. And there was certainly no shortage of work to be done in the area of housing. I mean, the homelessness crisis in Seattle had been all over the news. So I took very seriously the task of helping to administer this emergency money through ARPA. Now, before we talk about that money and why it didn't put a dent in homelessness, I want to remind you that in the last video in this series, I took you on a guided tour of the 6 major federal funding streams for housing that are coming in from the federal government through HUD and being pumped into local metro areas. And I also showed you how Milwaukee used those streams, along with a few other sources of federal and local funding, to create a dramatic 92% reduction in chronic homelessness using housing first. And I also showed you how applying that 3-step framework, where you define your question zero, what it is you really want to accomplish, you analyze your civic ecosystem to define all the relevant players in the space, and then you analyze your civic wallet so that you can create a plan to move that money to address your question zero in the most effective way. And now we're going to use that same exact framework as a diagnostic tool to help us figure out exactly what went wrong in Seattle. Now, in terms of the Civic wallet, I'm not going to recap those federal streams in depth right here. You can watch the last video for that. But rest assured, there is no shortage of money to address homelessness and housing in the Seattle metro area. Even the regular structural streams of federal funding we saw in Part 2 are staggeringly larger in the Seattle area. Plus, this metro is putting in not just tens of millions, but around $200 million in additional housing resources from the city, the county, and the state. I mean, these are resources that don't even exist in most other places. And while it only has 2.5 times the population of Milwaukee, Seattle is spending over 7 times as much money for housing. So this is a lot of money already circulating in the Civic wallet that's being deployed towards homelessness. And that amount alone is enough to make you scratch your head. I mean, why isn't the Seattle Metro already able to address homelessness with all this regularly scheduled money? And we'll get to that. But this video is about something even more dramatic and perplexing. It's about the fact that right as I was arriving there, we were getting this single largest one-time ever drop of homelessness aid from Congress in the form of these emergency housing vouchers worth $25 million a year, which translates to 1,300 long-term housing vouchers that were going to provide stable housing for years for the people who got them. And even with that, several years later, homelessness was worse than ever. So does that mean federal programs are ineffective? Is there fraud, waste, and abuse going on? I mean, did we just not spend the money in time? What the heck is going on? Well, before you can get to the bottom of that, let's talk about how this money was supposed to work. So that spring, housing authorities around the country got a letter from HUD saying they would be getting these vouchers and what their allocation was. But they had to partner with their local HUD-designated Continuum of Care organization to make sure we were deploying them to actual homeless people. And if you'll recall from Part 2, that's the local agency responsible for the comprehensive homelessness system and administering HUD money to try to get homeless people into the right kind of permanent housing or support, which they most often do by contracting work out to private nonprofits and other agencies. Now, in contrast, you have this big other system over here. You have housing authorities administering public housing in Section 8, other really large streams, typically the largest streams of federal housing dollars put into any local metro. And while housing authorities can and often do use their local flexibilities to target their programs to homeless or chronically homeless folks, they're just not designed in the same way as a continuum of care. They're not built for speed, let's just say. And that's not their fault. Housing authorities are mostly housing people who qualify because they meet a certain income threshold. And they get access to housing when their number finally comes up on the waiting list. At any given time, there are many more people who meet the income eligibility requirements than there is funding to actually help them. And that's just the way things work with this funding because it is not designed like an entitlement. So this money, this housing authority money, at least the general way it works is it's not fast, but it provides this long-term sort of structural element of housing in a community for some low-income people. And there's a lot of different kinds of people getting this housing. A heck of a lot of senior citizens, people with severe disabilities who can't work, working families, immigrants. But I think what can get lost is that this is an enormous, complicated program that's housing 9 million people in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of different stories in there. And studies have shown that most people who get the Section 8 subsidy are typically in that housing for 7 years, which, as you can imagine, is about how long it can take sometimes to move from one season of life to another, improving your economic circumstances so you can afford housing on the private market. And so it's when people leave that you see new units come available. But the continuum of care money, that's designed to do something really different. It's designed more for crisis. It's designed to ensure there is a connection point for actual homeless people right now to get them into the system, assess them, and get them into some right mix of housing and services. Tailored to them. I mean, are they a single mom who's just lost their job, been kicked out of their apartment, and is sleeping doubled up with their cousin? Or is it like a homeless veteran who's been living on the streets for 25 years? I mean, those are very different needs, right? So these emergency housing vouchers were designed to be a logical marriage. The homelessness system having to work with these bigger entities administering long-term housing subsidies to really add a measure of stability for a lot of people experiencing something very difficult. But the details of how that actually would work, well, like we discussed in part 1, whenever the federal government puts money into local communities, there is a lot of choice about how you actually design the operations of that thing. And before I can tell you how successful we were or weren't, let's bring back the 3-step framework as a lens to look through. It helps to start with question 0, meaning what is it that you're really trying to solve here? And then the bigger picture, Seattle leaders have been trying to end homelessness for a very long time. All the way back in 2005, Seattle created a 10-year plan to end homelessness. The only problem was that 2015 came and went without ending homelessness, so local leaders threw that plan out and created a whole new plan and a whole new regional coordinating body that would serve as the HUD Continuum of Care. It was called the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And all of those participating jurisdictions, because remember, King County has 39 cities. Well, they have really struggled to do that thing that the framers of the Constitution themselves had to struggle through, to compromise and agree on a plan to move forward. That difficulty was there in the old organization, and it was showing up in the new one. So that was the context in which we were operating in 2021, where you have this brand new, untested organization, rife with a lot of political divisiveness. That was the one the local housing authorities were going to have to be working with to get these vouchers into the hands of actual homeless people. And we had a deadline. We had to do it within a year. And you can already see from the start that this thing is on pretty shaky ground. So was that the reason why this money didn't make a dent in homelessness? Well, the 3 housing authorities signed a memorandum of understanding to partner with this new regional homelessness body to get these vouchers into the hands of people who needed them. And so that was our more pressing question 0 right here. The question was, how are we going to do this? As I mentioned, local jurisdictions have a tremendous amount of choice in exactly how this was going to work. Finding homeless people who are ready to move into an apartment, whether in tents or transitional housing, is no small task. Working with them on all the things you need, like finding a unit, which includes helping you with the application, dealing with your credit history, making sure you have services to stay stable in that place if you need mental health support or recovery services. Well, housing authorities themselves are typically not staffed or funded to do this. For the number of vouchers we administer, Congress basically gives us just enough staff so that we can verify your income, issue the voucher, and say good luck finding an apartment. Our caseworkers typically have a caseload of 500 to 600 files. And how are you going to get all this other stuff done that you would need to make it successful? Well, keep in mind you're operating in an ecosystem and there are many other organizations that do pieces and parts of this work. And so you can decide to achieve that a simple way, like where the regional homelessness body would contract that work out to maybe 2 or 3 large groups. Or you can choose to do it in a more complicated way. Now, in this community, the theory was that different nonprofits have trust with different populations, and they know how to reach them and work with them. And many of those organizations have in their midst people with lived experience. So the new KCRHA chose to subcontract all of that finding, navigating, and supporting work out to 85 different nonprofits and agencies. And to us at the Housing Authority, that's a lot of potential fail points. Anybody who runs a business understands that when you control all aspects of an operation, you can pivot a lot faster when things go wrong. I mean, you could fire people who aren't doing their jobs. But if you do things through contracts, you do lose a measure of speed and control. And you do hear these horror stories in the news about Congress issuing funds, but slow and sluggish agencies dragging their feet on getting it spent. There was certainly a high risk of that happening here. So is that the reason this money didn't put a dent in homelessness? Well, good housing authorities live and die by this thing called their utilization rate. I mean, they do not ever want to find themselves having precious taxpayer money allocated by Congress going unspent, especially in the face of an open and apparent housing crisis. I mean, you can actually look at this public dashboard that HUD maintains about how your own community's housing authority is performing on that. And there was a very specific one set up for these emergency housing vouchers. Now, people always think government is necessarily incompetent. I'm going to take you inside the machine for a minute because this is the part that never makes the news. Now, if you want the big picture, feel free to skip ahead, but I think it's worth seeing what good government actually looks like. In any business, when you're dealing with forces outside your control, your ability to duck and sway while still hitting your goals depends on how well you form your assumptions, how well you set up your data indicators, and how well you act with agility when it counts. And that is no different in government. Getting vouchers issued to people who need them and over the finish line and into housing is all about forecasting. And success means that homeless person is now leased up and moved all the way into an apartment. So how do you do that in a specific time frame? Well, you first pinpoint the number of referrals you need week by week. And then you figure out how many vouchers you need to issue week by week. And then you track how many lease-ups you're getting week by week. And you front load your expectations, so you have time to course correct if you're not hitting any one of those targets. And you actually set those targets higher than you expect will actually consummate, because there will always be some people who don't make it over the finish line. And there were a lot of things out of our control. Were we going to get the referrals we needed? Even getting to the point where you can issue a voucher to a homeless person is complicated. There's a lot of regulatory stuff we've got to verify. So you're waiting on people bringing in paperwork who might not even have a copy of their driver's license anymore. And only once you've done that can you actually issue a voucher, which finally lets that person take that voucher to a landlord and apply for an apartment. And then can that person actually get approved? I mean, say they do. The landlord has to enter a contract with the housing authority, and there are a lot of other checks that have to be done to comply with federal regulation. And only then can all of it be finalized. That's a lot of steps that can go sideways, which is why we had a pretty slick dashboard and we watched it like hawks. If we hit a bump in the road, we pivoted. And we set up a system of redundancies wherever we could. Say some percentage of the nonprofits doing referral and navigation work don't uphold their end of the bargain. Well, we created a separate team of best-in-class housing navigators with some flexible funding we raised, so that there was this backup pool of support people. And then you had all the potential fail points in the housing market itself. I mean, were there even 1,300 available units in the community to absorb these vouchers? I mean, this rental market was tight for everybody. So we knew we had to get early knowledge of available units into the hands of all these navigators, working mostly at these outside nonprofits. And we also needed to have folks warming up the private market landlords to this. And a lot of that was done by this really great nonprofit called Housing Connector, who worked with private market landlords and supported them through the Section 8 process, so they felt more comfortable taking on folks who might be a riskier tenant to bet on. We were not going to let this thing fail, and we didn't. As a result of these efforts, the Seattle Metro with these 3 housing authorities was the first or second fastest in the nation to get these vouchers fully into the hands of people who qualified for them. Every single voucher was used by the deadline. We were so successful that HUD even gave us a few more vouchers from communities that didn't manage to spend all the money. So, to answer the question, did homelessness grow due to government incompetence? No. I mean, this is actually a success story about conquering that civic ecosystem and all of the sprawl and individual power centers, actors, and fail points. And of course, there's that old phrase about moving at the speed of trust, and it certainly helped that we trusted the leadership of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority with their strategy about working with all of these 85 different agencies. It was true that they had the trust of the community, people with lived experience, and boy, did that help on getting the job done. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the heroic efforts of the KCHA team. Without them, we never could have pulled this off. On this front, this particular sub-question 0, our Civic ecosystem and the Civic wallet all worked in total harmony. So how is it the case that homelessness still gets worse at the 2024 count? Well, remember when I talked about the 3-step framework in the last video? A part of defining your question 0 is getting clear on what it's going to cost to address whatever problem at the true scale at which it exists. And the thing I haven't shown you yet is the actual number of homeless people we were dealing with. Here's the total homelessness count in Seattle, King County in January 2022. And here it is in 2024, well after full deployment of these vouchers. 1,300 people housed, that's great, but it only represents less than 10% of the need. Here's this raging forest fire, and all of this emergency money, as huge as it sounds, is only the equivalent of a garden hose. But the real question is, how on earth did this problem get so bad to begin with? Is it all the fault of civic sprawl, that problem we've talked about all throughout the series? Having so many nonprofits and government agencies that nobody can get them all on the same page? Well, take a look at this 2018 news clip. The then United Way director seemed to think something like that was to blame.
A lot of good intentioned ideas and organizations are asking for money in uncoordinated ways.
When you think about it, 100 nonprofits, 3 housing authorities, and 39 cities is civic sprawl to the max. Plus you have whole other verticals to coordinate, like community mental health and public safety, which have been pretty widely regarded as insufficient in the Seattle metro. And with mental health care, that's certainly nationwide, because if you watched my Milwaukee video, you saw that the number of state mental institution beds dropped from 339 for every 100,000 people in 1955 to only 22 in the year 2000. And that's a good thing for many reasons, but we just never really replaced them with anything. But let's check all that against another large metro, Houston, Texas. Because Houston has been in the news for the remarkable success they've had fighting homelessness using Housing First. So have they just got fewer nonprofits and less service delivery chaos to contend with? Well, if you look under the hood, Houston actually has over 100 organizations involved in its HUD fund and continuum of care. They've got 31 cities in Harris County alone, plus they've got 2 other counties involved in their regional homelessness response. And they're getting some fantastic results. So that's obviously not it. So is what's going on in Seattle just the result of poor liberal choices attracting all these homeless people with programs, goodies, and handouts? Or is it just that Seattle leaders are somehow lacking in sophistication and intelligence in going about their efforts? Well, the folks in Seattle were actually availing themselves of some of the very same expertise as the world's largest multinational corporations. Case in point, they hired McKinsey, the global management consulting firm, to come in and study Seattle's intractable homelessness problem. And their report nailed the cause. The Seattle region's stunning economic growth, coupled with a failure to build enough homes, created an imbalance in the supply of housing against the demand for it. So much so that the gap between housing supply and demand has driven up prices to the point where the poorest simply can no longer afford housing without public support. And when you don't have enough housing, the housing you do have just goes to the highest bidder. This shortage has been widely documented. A 2020 study said that the Seattle metro area was 70,000 homes short of what it actually needed for the size of its population. And it's gotten much worse now. And so if you think about it, this homelessness crisis makes complete sense. Struggling folks who once upon a time could get by in a cheap short-term downtown hotel can no longer do so because that hotel just doesn't exist anymore. So with all this growth and this huge population boom, that means we can't really just blame all these Seattle leaders for homelessness, right? It's just what happens. Well, not so fast. Yes, Seattle King County's population did grow by 31% over a 20-year time period, but let's check that against Houston's Harris County. They actually grew by 39% during the exact same period of time. Seattle has 72 homeless people for every 10,000 residents, but Houston has only 6. So why the heck was Houston able to keep up with this growth, but Seattle couldn't? Well, that answer largely comes down to overregulation of the residential construction market. You will find all kinds of sources citing this, liberal ones, conservative ones, even boring economic policy papers. So if that's the case, who is really responsible for that? I mean, if you think back to part 2 in the 3-step framework and you're mapping your civic ecosystem, and what you want to do is make sure you're talking to all of the relevant players around housing, I mean, who is in charge of regulating or incentivizing housing supply? Do we just look up to the top? To understand who really controls housing supply in America, you have to understand something most people take for granted. The modern American housing market didn't just emerge from nature. Yes, early in our pre-industrial history, people were out building cabins on the frontier. But this modern home buying construct we've been living for the past century, during which time most of us have been busy working jobs, was itself constructed, deliberately, by the federal government and the big banks, starting in the 1930s, which was when Congress built the modern mortgage machine. Welcome to the New Deal. The New Deal housing system had 2 layers, which created the recipe to standardize and scale mortgages as we know them. FHA insurance, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which create liquidity for banks. What's liquidity? The bank makes a mortgage. Fannie Mae then buys it if it meets their standard. They sell it to Wall Street and the bank gets cash, which they use to make more mortgages, because they're no longer limited by their balance sheet in the number of loans they can make. Before all that, mortgages were mostly short-term balloon loans and banks weren't exactly lining up to take big long-term risks on the average Joe.
The mortgages back then were pretty bad. You had to make a 50% down payment and the mortgage was only for 5 years.
So Congress's actions to open up the floodgates of lending certainly helped create a lot more housing. And the federal government still undergirds this entire system through the mortgage interest tax deduction, bank regulation, and overall monetary policy. Plus, it incentivizes affordable housing production through the low-income housing tax credit. And in most communities, the biggest source of housing subsidy still is usually federal Section 8, which mostly flows through local housing authorities to private landlords, who sometimes use this cash flow as part of their revenue model when planning new apartment construction. And it's not an accident that all of the major federal housing policy that the social sector cares about flows through a single, very powerful Senate committee, the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Did you notice that housing sits inside of banking? That tells you something important about how this construct was always designed, as a financial product first. So you can't say the federal government has nothing to do with housing supply. But the question of whether you are allowed to build something in any given place at any particular time in this country, well, that power is still held by an arcane subunit of your local government, the building department, the zoning board, the planning commission, and possibly even the historical review board. Oh, and an even trickier one to spot, the environmental review agencies. And I've seen this regulatory gridlock firsthand, managing over 3,000 units of public housing. Even basic safety improvements, like adding lighting to a dark parking lot with rising crime or installing a playground in a development with lots of families, could be subject to environmental reviews that would trigger years of delay. And don't get me started on our attempts to add more affordable housing to different neighborhoods. Because here's what's even trickier. It's not just the bureaucrats who put the brakes on development. Local residents have the power to effectively veto development projects, and they do so all the time, all across America. On the whole other side of the country from Seattle, I recently watched a nearly 50-unit residential mixed-use development on a busy main street in my hometown of Snyder, New York, get killed because of local resident opposition. So instead of getting housing for dozens of families, along with a dynamic mix of residential and commercial spaces plus a parking deck, this community is now getting a single jewelry store in its place. And why wouldn't the neighbors protest? This isn't just about preserving neighborhood character. It's a rational economic choice for any homeowner. Housing shortages drive up home equity. And defending your own interests, it's a perfectly normal and expected exercise of liberty under the Constitution. But this all does tend to get a little accentuated by this other factor. Political scientists and behavioral economists have known for many years that people come out of their houses to say no to things that they don't want much more than to say yes to things that they do. This fundamental truth is exploited in every single political campaign, and you see it playing out at every zoning meeting where there are people protesting some kind of development project everywhere around the country.
This whole project is where democracy goes to die.
Congestion parking not safe.
Time and again, they rallied opponents to protest a pair of planned apartment developments.
This simple truth also makes building coalitions for comprehensive reform incredibly difficult. It's easy to organize around a loud no. It's much less sexy to organize around a complicated yes. And here's what makes this even worse when it comes to housing supply and homelessness. It's something to do with our design. The housing market is regional. When you're going to move to an area, you're typically looking all across the region for the right home for you. But the power to regulate that market is not. It's subdivided into 39 individual cities in King County alone. And no local politician in any of those cities wants angry residents screaming at them or protesting in front of their office. So even if they understand the link between housing scarcity and homelessness, each city can block housing and shove the pressure onto the city next door, and no single official is accountable for the regional consequences. Quick note that the Washington State Growth Management Act can actually stop local officials who may want to allow more growth, but we'll have to come back to that later in another video. And comprehensive reform, whether we're talking about aligning all the tools like spending and regulation, or aligning all the relevant jurisdictions in an area, rarely has a constituency or a staff. And I think it's because nobody's taught to think about problems like this. We have many, many more specialists than we have generalists in our civic environments. And the young people who have a spark to go out and change something don't really get offered any clear pathway that teaches them how to connect all the dots and learn how to influence solutions that are comprehensive, systems level, grounded in how power and money are really divided in this country. I mean, just think about it. For young people who have that kind of spark, you either get pushed into something that's more about individual service, like social work, or you end up in a pathway that's designed more around advocacy, organizing, protest, things of that nature. And now both of those are important in our civic lives, but they are not enough. So let me take you into my story for a minute. As a young person, I was really fascinated with the problem of why some neighborhoods in a region had declined economically while others were thriving. Actually, fascinated isn't the right word for it. I was infuriated by it. You see, throughout college, I had been teaching violin in an array of different after-school programs across the city, ranging from an elite private school to a Black Baptist church in the central city. And I had the most talented kid in that church program, but the leaders there wouldn't even let him take the instrument home to practice because so many bad actors had stolen them from kids just like him before. And that kid would never have the same access to quality schools, parks, public goods and services, that kind of fertilizer for human potential, just because of where he happened to have been born. So I went to law school to learn about some of the policy levers that helped create this neighborhood in the first place, like redlining, segregated public housing, and running highways like this one right through Black neighborhoods. And I launched into a career as a public interest attorney. The paradigm in that world is about finding the bad actor, stopping the harmful practice, passing the right law, getting justice done. And none of what I'm going to say next is to diminish the very serious importance of that work. But I just couldn't stay in that field for very long. Because I was always chasing something that didn't seem to exist there, something more systems level. I mean, how would you dramatically transform the school system that kid was growing up in? How would you strengthen the private market to reinvest in his neighborhood or grow it economically from within? Not by getting a court judgment, not by passing a single law, but how do you unleash bigger change than that? Because if you teach your most highly civically motivated, smart young people that the only way to make change is through battles, protests, and throwing down a hard no through the court system, what you end up with is a society rife with what political scientist Francis Fukuyama calls veto points, where anyone at any time can stop anything from happening.
So if you ask, why is it that high-speed rail doesn't exist today? There's zoning and permitting requirements. We in California have something called the California Environmental Quality Act that allows all 40 million citizens of California to sue anything they want with no statute of limitations. And as a result, you have a lot of veto points built into the way we make decisions and very little to force something that's in the collective interest.
As I moved into philanthropy and later into large-scale government housing operations, I began to see the limits of that approach. If you only pull on one lever at a time, only regulation or only spending, you will never solve a systems problem. Because that requires the whole toolkit. It requires spending and regulation working together. It requires the market working in a healthy way, and it also requires help for people who legitimately need it. And it requires alignment across the jurisdictions that actually control all of the relevant tools. Houston's story proves this better than anywhere. Houston is famous in urban planning circles because it has no zoning at all. So there's one of the barriers to building, poof, gone. But their success wasn't just about removing regulation so that the market could respond to the housing demand. Houston spent the money in their civic wallet very well to help people who needed it. They receive roughly the same amount of federal money into their homelessness system as does Seattle. Houston Mayor Anise Parker and the local players who controlled Houston's civic wallet aligned around Housing First and built a functioning system out of the same fragmented collection of nonprofits and government agencies you find in any large metro area. And I have to give a shout out to my old boss Robin Walls, Mark Thiele, and the team at the Houston Housing Authority, who made genuinely smart choices about how to deploy their Section 8 funding to support Housing First. That's exactly the civic wallet strategy I talked about in the Part 2 video on Milwaukee. And you know what? It worked. Houston got results. But the fact that the scale of their challenge was much smaller because they occupied a totally different regulatory environment is not something we can ignore. The McKinsey report on Seattle was clear about this too. Yes, you have to fix the housing supply problem, but in a place where homelessness has gotten this bad, you're also going to have to make some pretty gargantuan investments to stabilize the crisis. And so let me be clear, the fact that the emergency housing voucher funding is ending earlier than many expected is going to create real suffering and challenges for communities. But we should not be surprised that the funding has ended, and let me tell you why. When Congress passed ARPA in 2021, the $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers was designed to cover roughly 70,000 households for nearly a decade. But how did they come up with that number? Especially when we're talking about a one-time emergency allocation. Well, the math was based on this. You take the national average Section 8 monthly rent subsidy at 2021 market rates, multiply it by the number of vouchers, add modest annual increases of around 5 to 6%, which is what HUD had been projecting for years, and $5 billion gets you to approximately 2030. But what nobody factored in was what actually happened to rents. Between early 21 and 2022, the exact window when these vouchers were being rolled out, national rents exploded by nearly 16% in a single year, according to Zillow. That's nearly 3 times the rate HUD anticipated. And because housing vouchers pay the gap between what a low-income family can afford and what market rent actually is in a particular city, every dollar rents went up meant the federal government was paying more per voucher than the model had ever anticipated. By one measure, fair market rents in some markets rose over 40% between 2021 and 2025. But the fact that that happened shouldn't really have come as a surprise. I mean, this was the third of 3 stimulus bills. We were pumping more money into the economy that runaway inflation seemed to be the inevitable consequence to many people. Larry Summers, the former Democratic Treasury Secretary, was publicly warning in February of 21 that macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels would set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. But Democrats in Washington largely brushed him off. And other prominent economists like Paul Krugman were absolutely gunning for this third stimulus bill. And in an emergency scenario where Congress is trying to get $1.9 trillion approved and out the door fast, nobody is stopping to stress test the rent escalation assumption buried inside a $5 billion program that's only worth 1/4% of the bill. I mean, the EHV program was essentially a rounding error in the larger picture, which is exactly why its budget math never really got a second look. And the program is running out of money much earlier than many anticipated. And yeah, it's possible to look at the current administration and Congress and blame them for not extending the program, but it's not factually accurate to say that they ended it. They just let it end. And I'm offering this clarification not to diminish the very real malfeasance taking place at the federal level right now, or this administration's convenient disavowal of all of the data on Housing First, silence on the fact that it gets implemented differently everywhere due to federalism, disregard of massive national generational cuts to essential adjacent programs like mental health care.
But Reagan screwed up a lot. He screwed up mental health in this country.
And straight up misinforming people about all of that because it's easy to whip up your base of support with a simple soundbite or editorial. But the reason I'm telling you this is so that you can just stay a little bit more with the facts. And you can be a little bit more immune to being told what to think, or just feeling like we're all victims to what's happening at the federal level. Because when we receive funding like this, at the local level, we have to understand the facts about it and prepare the people we're bringing into the program, and either create a plan to ultimately bring them into the core Section 8 program as people leave it, or transition these folks fast to independence to mitigate the tragedy of the rug being pulled out from under them when the funding just ends. But here's the deeper problem with all this for a place like Seattle. Even if someone had stopped to run better numbers, even if HUD's budget model had perfectly anticipated the rent spike, for that community, that only fixes one relatively small program on the spending side of the equation. The reason homelessness got worse in Seattle despite all this money isn't just because these specific bonus vouchers ran out faster than anticipated. It's the fact that no amount of federal spending can compensate for a regional housing market that isn't building enough homes. And fixing that imbalance requires aligning spending and regulation and local zoning and state law and political will and the will of the people across dozens of independent jurisdictions simultaneously and over the long haul. Which is exactly what a federal emergency appropriations bill by design cannot do. So the crisis continues. We continue to make policy in a completely haphazard way, and people keep pointing fingers and making up stories about who is to blame in the way that it suits them best. But it all makes perfect sense. You know, this alignment of spending and regulation is exactly what we see in other countries that are so often cited as delivering housing first well, like Finland, Ireland, and Portugal. But I often get really annoyed when people bring them up to me. Like, we should just copy them and homelessness will be solved. Do you know why? Because we'd need to have a whole other constitutional convention to copy their approach. Those countries aren't designed anything like the US. They all have unitary systems of government, not federal. What that means is that their local or state or provincial governments aren't independent power centers. They're essentially agents of the central government, implementers. And yeah, that's an oversimplification, but generally speaking, when the top says, oh, housing is a human right, we're doing housing first, the money and the regulations can be aligned much more easily. But here, the states aren't agents of the federal government, they're sovereigns that hold real power. And below them, cities and counties hold their own forms of local control. To do something comprehensive in the US, you have to get everybody who controls the relevant resources and regulations at every level across every jurisdiction to agree of their own volition. And of course the citizens too, because that's where all power really comes from in the US. And I still think that's way better than everybody being forced to accept some top-down mandate. It respects you and me and our power and agency as individuals. But getting policy agreement and alignment is made much harder by another force that the framers did not envision or anticipate when they set this whole thing up. Political parties. The framers did not like them or anticipate them when they designed the US Constitution. In fact, here's what George Washington himself had to say about political parties at the famous speech he gave at the end of his presidency. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. And they could have never imagined the intense levels of political polarization we are experiencing right now. So even when the evidence is overwhelming and the solutions are well documented, people often can't see past the team jersey they're wearing. And it happens on all sides of the political spectrum. This supply side problem, aka the regulatory barriers that strangle housing supply, has been written about clearly, compellingly, and with rigorous documentation by progressive writers. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson laid it all out in abundance. Regulatory barriers that prevent the market from responding to housing demand produce these homelessness crises we see in many coastal cities. But in a polarized environment, the moment a solution gets associated with the wrong team, people stop engaging, even when the facts are on the table. You could see this exact tension playing out in the Washington state legislature. By 2022, the situation had gotten so bad that the State House actually began considering whether to take away local zoning control, to make it illegal for cities to restrict apartment construction. But all along the way, you could clearly see politicians on the left expressing skepticism about siding with developers, as if clearing the way to build enough housing to respond to a very clear population boom was somehow a betrayal of progressive values. They ultimately did pass that law, but all of it was way too little and way too late. And let me just stop here and say for a minute that sometimes people say we just need to have a lot more subsidized housing. I can explain why in another video, but let's just say it is not something we can afford to do in places where you have 16,000 homeless people. So what could have been done to prevent this crisis in Seattle? If I had a time machine, I would zoom back in time and get all those relevant Seattle area leaders working through the 3-step framework. And when we did step 2, analyzing the civic ecosystem, we would be doing it in a much more rigorous, open, and inclusive way. Really asking, what are all the laws or regulations that might have an impact on this issue? Who is responsible for them? Are they in the room? And who else should be in the room? Not just homelessness advocates, agency directors, and some politicians who care about this, but really including housing developers, multifamily apartment complex owners, nonprofit and for-profit. Now, some people are against that because they're skeptical of business or corporate involvement. But if you talk about being inclusive, then let's really be inclusive. Because that's kind of what democracy is all about, isn't it? At the end of the day, the money flowed, the intention was there, the model was right, and it still didn't work. Because decision makers were very likely leaving out core pieces of intelligence they needed to be factoring in at the time when it really mattered. So slowly, over time, and without anybody really noticing, Seattle-King County created a situation where an entire metro area was prevented from doing something that every civilization has had to do since the beginning of time. Ensure there is enough housing to meet the needs of a growing population. This is our American mess. This is the blessing and the curse the framers gave us, playing out in real time. Because of our liberty, our decentralized power, and our local control, we're free to create as much government and as many private charitable organizations as we want to. And we're also free to make really big messes, because nobody is naturally looking out for the big picture. So does this mean the answer is just to act more like Finland or Portugal? To take these values the framers gave us and set them aside in favor of top-down central control, if it was able to better execute housing policy? Well, before you answer that, let's not look to another country. Let's look to nature. Do you know what happens when a colony of 10,000 honeybees outgrows its hive and needs to find a new home? The queen doesn't decide. There is no single bee in charge. What happens instead is that scout bees fan out on their own. They go find candidate sites. They come back, and they literally dance. And the better the site they found, the longer and more vigorously they dance. Other scouts watch, they follow, they go check those sites out. They come back and dance too. Competing sites get debated, signal and counter-signal, until slowly, without anyone in charge, 10,000 bees converge on the best available home. Cornell biologist Thomas Ely has studied this for decades. The swarm almost always makes the best decision.
One of the things that the bees do in their decision-making process, which is critical to its success, is that each individual scout bee only votes for a site after she's made her own personal inspection of the site. You don't have any fads of ideas. You never see one scout bee perform a dance to advertise or advocate a site simply because she's seen another bee performing a dance for that site.
So what can we learn from this? Decentralized systems can achieve extraordinary collective intelligence without a top-down authority, but only when the individuals have a reliable medium for sharing real information with each other in a deliberative process that works. The framers, whether they realized it or not, were sort of laying down the foundation for a human version of this. Just think about it. Individual liberty, decentralized power, local control, freedom to associate, organize, to go solve problems together. These weren't just protections against tyranny, they were laying down some of the foundational conditions that make it possible to leverage distributed collective intelligence. They imagined everyone pursuing their own happiness, and in so doing, factions would arise with different individual interests. Those interests would be debating and duking it out, getting to the right decisions through an honest process that promotes the common good. So no, the answer to the earlier question isn't that we need more top-down control. Imagine what we lose with that. Arriving at an agreement is so much better than being forced to comply. But we can only hope to do that if the signal is clean. Those bee scouts share real information and they have an honest debate. Somewhere along the way for us, the signal got jammed by political parties that need us angry and divided to hold on to power, by media business models built on outrage, by algorithms that profit from feeding us ideas that make us hate the other bees in our own hive, by the slow erosion of the shared civic spaces where we used to actually talk to one another, by an education system that stopped teaching us how to think about public life together. And don't get me started about the impact of money in politics. But there's something else we never talk about. The very structure of our government itself, the way power and decisions are divided at the federal, state, and local levels in ways that are largely opaque to the American public simply because they become too complex to reasonably digest, makes it very hard for us to have an honest dance with each other about anything. The bees don't have to overcome any of that. We do. And we have to do so at the wildest time. We are hurtling towards change at a pace I don't think anybody can fully fathom. The $38 trillion federal debt, the acceleration of AI, changes to the geopolitical order and the monetary system itself. And yet at the very same time, it seems like we're stuck in one place. Complexity in the civic environment makes it feel impossible to change some of the very clearly dysfunctional areas of government. And we may want to blame the bureaucrats and politicians for that, but I say we need to take a hard look at the design and what it has produced, and more importantly, think about what it really demands of us as citizens. Because if we don't get this democratic republic to work better, we seriously risk losing it. While in theory, this constitutional design was supposed to give us all power and protect against tyranny, what we now have is a system that shows up as genuinely decentralized at the local level, local zoning, fragmented service delivery, chaos organizing all of our funding, and genuinely centralized and centralizing further where it matters most to certain kinds of interests. Monetary policy, banking and securities regulation, and the infrastructure of money itself. Because that thing George Washington warned us about, we can all plainly see that it has taken place. While all this bottom-up chaos is happening, we're fighting about funding cuts, experiencing outrage at the daily news cycle, and getting angry at our neighbors for flying a different political flag. A very real consolidation of power has been taking place up at the top. And this construct we live in, the one that was set up in the 1930s and 40s, it's changing. Through bills like the Genius Act and the Clarity Act, right now the monetary system itself is being quietly restructured in ways that most civic actors don't understand, and almost nobody is talking about on the right or the left.
We're just at the beginning of the tokenization of all assets, from real estate.
We will be talking about that much more on this channel, so that we can have a hand in shaping what comes next. But don't be mistaken. At every level of government, people will harness this tribalism, this confusion about what is really going on, and use it to craft whatever narrative helps them maintain their power. The framers set up an incredible operating system for us, one that gives us real power and liberty, but it's also one that demands that we the people do not fall asleep at the wheel. Despite all of our headwinds, I am still optimistic we can be more like the bees. We the people can rise to a higher level of civic intelligence without sacrificing individual liberty and local power. At this moment in history, we have available to us better tools than we've ever had to leverage this phenomenal amount of distributed human intelligence. We just have to figure out how to use them. You can use the framework I gave you as a place to start. Ask all of these questions. Who controls what power? And when they're hoarding it, why? What money is there? How does it work? And what will it take to unleash it in a better direction? Form a common factual understanding together. With real people you can look in the eye. Just whatever you do, do not start from the place of your political conclusions. If you tend to lean left, know that not every regulation is good. Not every way we spend money is worthwhile or sustainable. The programs we set up in the 1930s and 40s will not be the ones we need in the 2030s and 40s. And the state sovereignty that's baked into our Constitution may become more important than ever. And if you tend to lean right, know that not all public spending is bad. Some of it is very necessary. Last time I checked, we all benefit from having things like a road that connects to your driveway that you personally don't need to build or maintain. And we all benefit from having a literate population, which are both a product of collective investment. And some regulations truly are written in blood, as they say. But no matter where you start, be very suspicious of anyone who tells you you can't consider certain kinds of ideas or talk with certain kinds of people. And if you do, you're siding with the enemy. Because dehumanizing your neighbor because they fly a different political flag, well, if you've ever studied history, you know that's the real danger because of what it makes societies capable of. And we cannot forget that the division of the people is one of the oldest tools of power. Do not be caught up in this false notion that we can't change things. That's only beneficial to the people who benefit from the status quo. In the Part 2 video, Milwaukee showed us what's possible, but also the incredible mountain of bureaucracy we'll somehow need to reorganize if we want real reform. It's time to stop giving our power upward and outward. The framers didn't set this whole thing up for passive consumers of government goods and services. They designed it for active agents shaping our collective destiny. So let's get our hands back on the controls. And it starts with learning. Take a look at the resources linked down below that can help you do that. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you on future videos.